Hello, hello, hello. I'm Omar Moore, and welcome to this audio commentary for the movie I Am Not Your Negro, directed by Raoul Peck. Now, this is an unofficial commentary. It's not something that has been officially sanctioned by Magnolia Pictures or anybody else connected to this excellent documentary. So there's a lot of themes here, and James Baldwin, of course, is the great influential figure who is behind a lot of this. Of course, he wrote a 30-page manuscript called Remember This House. He actually was writing it for part of a larger book, and he never got to finish it. And this documentary you are watching right now is one that chronicles the lives of three individuals and their relationship to America, and also connects the past to the present. And it also argues that there never really was a past, it's just a continuing present, and that's a view I agree with. Also, one of the great challenges that James Baldwin lay out to white America was the idea of taking responsibility, and taking responsibility for looking at yourself and looking at your life and looking at your existence, and why you, as a white person in America at large, the culture at large, and why white people at large in America have architected an artificial boogeyman, and that boogeyman being black people, or as James Baldwin and as Americans said back in the 1960s, Negroes, and in the 1950s as well, that term was used. Why is it that white Americans would construct a completely artificial, some kind of boogeyman? It's something that James Baldwin leaves us to ponder at the very end of this documentary, which I hope you've already seen before you've watched this time around, and also before you've heard my voice on this. There's so many things going on in this excellent documentary, and there you see the titles, I Am Not Your Negro, and you see James Baldwin's name. James Baldwin was one of the 20th century's most influential figures by a mile, and whether Time magazine or any other publication says it or not is irrelevant. He was one of the 20th century, arguably one of the top 3 or 4 most influential figures in the 20th century. Certainly in America was one of the most influential figures. I'd say easily in the top 5 or 10 in America, and one of the world's most influential figures as well in the 20th century. Baldwin passed away in the early 1990s, by the way. His loss was a tremendous loss to the United States and to the world. He was somebody who I've been greatly influenced by, and wrote many great books. The Fire Next Time in particular. He wrote, of course, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, Another Country, Blues for Mr. Charlie. So many memorable, and I'm sure I've left out a lot of his other great works. Memorable, great writer, great orator, great debater. Baldwin was an incisive figure, and somebody who I urge you to read. I do urge people to read Baldwin. Seek him out. Go online, Google James Baldwin books, James Baldwin or James Baldwin books. You will see all the titles of his books, and I urge you to read them. Take one. I'm recording this in the summer of 2017, early summer, just before summer officially begins. I do urge you, in the summer or in any part of any year that you are listening to my voice, to please go online, go to a library, look and seek out James Baldwin, borrow his books, buy his books. Please, because go to an independent bookstore and buy his books or order his books. Start to read them. He will, I think, will change your views on a lot of things, and he will help you to see things in a very different perspective than you may be accustomed to. And he will open your mind. So I wanted to start with that. I should not forget to tell you that Samuel L. Jackson does the voiceover. And it's not just a voiceover. I think to call it just a voiceover actually trivializes the excellent work that Sam Jackson does in this film. He is the soul of James Baldwin, and he speaks through Baldwin. He portrays Baldwin, and he's reading Baldwin's words from this 30-page manuscript. But James Baldwin's voice comes through so profoundly here that you don't even really hear Sam Jackson. And when I first saw this film, I didn't even know that Sam Jackson had done the voice. I hadn't looked. I hadn't had any advanced knowledge of it. So I wondered, whose voice is this? It was so powerful and compassionate and warm and contemplative and penetrating and so many other things. And then it wasn't until the end that I realized it was Sam Jackson. Even when the opening credits came, I didn't really look at the opening credits the first time I saw it, and didn't really pay note of it to take a real stock of it. And then it was amazing. So please listen to Sam Jackson again. He's so good here, and I think that it's the best acting he's ever done. And I include all the on-screen performances he's done. I think this one is and this is obviously a vocal performance, not in front of the camera. I think this is the best work Samuel L. Jackson's ever done on film. I think the archival work that's done by the researchers for I Am Not Your Negro is superb. It is some of the best archival research I have ever seen performed and done for film. The editing is terrific too, and pictures tell all the story, and the words, of course, are punctuating them, or vice versa. And it's great footage, and I think that should be given a lot of credit here early on. A lot of information has been given to you already. We see Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Medgar Evers, and how these three men who James Baldwin was great friends with, close friends in fact with all of them, shaped America through the 1950s and 1960s, shaped the American resistance, if you will, to the racism and oppression that continued on into the 1950s and 60s, and that actually continues today. The troubadours were those three men, and there were other people, and this film will chronicle a few of them as well, but those were the three main people who, in that 1960s era, had been the most prominent spokespersons on behalf of many in the black community, in the Negro community back then, if you will. Now, there's something that's also very clear throughout this film, the idea of fantasy and reality, and imagery that is fantasy and imagery that's reality. This is the fantasy portion right here, and you'll see repeated juxtapositions of both of fantasy and reality. Times Square, New York, it's this, shot in 2016, this segment here. And you see all these iconographies for America, and James Baldwin's voiceover, he doesn't really miss any of these things. We now go to the archival footage and back to an earlier time. And what you see here, this is Harlem. And this is Harlem, I believe, in the 1950s. And James Baldwin is talking about Harlem and how he misses it. And look at this footage again here in black and white this time. 1950s and 60s footage of Harlem, where James Baldwin was born and raised. And you see the texture of the images, and then you hear the voiceover for Baldwin and how Baldwin missed the soul of his people, the people who he was produced from. And you feel the connection. And so this is the reality portion, and how Baldwin connects with this reality because it is whom he is from. So you've got fantasy and reality constantly bumping up against each other throughout this fine documentary by Raoul Peck. And there's an attempt to merge the two. They juxtapose against each other in ways that we haven't seen in lots of movies ever, at least that I haven't seen. I'll speak for myself. And even though this movie juxtaposes these two things, fantasy and reality, the movie never really merges them until later on. So we go back to the 1930s, and here's Dance Fools Dance, Joan Crawford, who I think in this clip is probably in her early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And Baldwin talks about how he was really taken in by how beautiful she was. And there was one of the first memories that James Baldwin had as a young boy, going to the movies and watching Dance Fools Dance, and how he was entranced by this image of Joan Crawford. And then at a store, I guess sometime later, he was in a store, a grocery store or something, and he saw a woman, a black woman who looked, in his words, exactly like Joan Crawford, incredibly beautiful, and looked almost exactly like her. And he said that he was so taken in by her as well, and he was not embarrassed when this particular woman in a store who looked just like Joan Crawford smiled at him. And he said he absolutely was taken in by her. So this kind of reality crystallized by fantasy, or fantasy in terms of the image of Joan Crawford on the big screen, being crystallized to reality by a woman that looked like Crawford, that James Baldwin came into contact with in a store. And so that was a memorable image for Baldwin at such a young age, and an impressionable age. Baldwin went to the movies often as a young man, a young boy. And he talks about Bill Miller here, and you see her there, a white woman who taught him, took him to the movies, took him to museums, took him to plays, took him all over, and gave him a real education, gave him books. And somebody who was very influential in his life made some very impressionable things happen for him. And so James Baldwin was a film critic too, and people don't really cite that very often, but he wrote a book called The Devil Finds Work, and I urge you to read that. And in that book, he crystallizes a lot of the social, cultural, and political implications of the imagery of the 1930s through the 1960s in that great book. And some of that book actually is cross-referenced here and utilized here in this movie. But I urge you to watch, to read The Devil Finds Work, James Baldwin's book, dealing with the movies and dealing with this era of the 1930s up through the 1960s. And Baldwin here has been talking about the fantasy again, and the reality, and the fantasy of the white fantasy, if you will, the Hollywood fantasy of black men in particular, and black women as well, being happy-go-lucky people and lazy and shiftless, that racist stereotype that white Hollywood films perpetuated for many decades, and in some ways still do, but in more subtle ways. But this one film, They Won't Forget, back in 1937, that was the name of it, They Won't Forget, talked about what James Baldwin saw as a real black man. And that was the one film out of all the films that James Baldwin saw early on in his life as a young boy that stayed with him, because he said Clinton Rosemond, who was in that film that we just saw a few moments ago here, represented a real black man, because it was a representation of the terror that he actually experienced as a young boy growing up in a very racist America, and the kind of terror that he saw sometimes in his dad's face. So he identified with that character, and in that film, the character played by Clinton Rosemond was someone who was accused of murdering a white woman, and he had to defend himself and protest his innocence and declare his innocence. The reality, again, you just saw again these images of fantasy and reality colliding with each other, and we just saw Stagecoach, the John Ford film starring John Wayne, and that's the kind of film that really was comical, cartoonish, and very offensive, because the Native Americans were looked at as these evildoers. And this was the kind of fantastical fantasy entertainment that Hollywood delivered up for white movie audiences. And in reality, John Wayne was not the hero of these pieces, he was the villain. But yet, white America and Americans, period, were cheering for John Wayne, murdering Native Americans, who of course were the indigenous and are the indigenous people to the United States and to America. So it's the inverse of what the reality is. And worse than that even, or as bad as that almost, is this fantasy depiction of John Wayne in a very immature way, taking target practice at the people whose land he and his, and his ancestors invaded, and taking target practice at the people whom he, not he particularly, but his ancestors and white ancestors genocided. A significant part of James Baldwin's early rise to prominence was his debate in the Cambridge University in the 1960s. And he debated William F. Buckley, the conservative American commentator. And it was a great debate that Baldwin actually did win. And it should be pointed out, this movie, I don't think, makes that clear. I guess it implies it, but it's not clearly stated. The point being is that Baldwin had convinced a room of white people, many of whom actually supported Baldwin's statement about the American Negro, which was the title of the debate topic, about the American dream for the American Negro. I don't remember the exact topic name, but Baldwin's position was successfully argued, and Baldwin came through and successfully argued his points. Baldwin makes a point during that debate about cheering for Gary Cooper, and when you as a black person didn't realize you were black, and you only got the awareness that you were when you really looked in a mirror at 6 or 7 years old, and this looked and realized that amongst the sea of white people that you lived around or saw on television, you were not white, that you were black. And you'd been cheering for Gary Cooper killing Native Americans, or cheering for John Wayne doing the same, and then you realize the Native Americans are you. And that moment always strikes home for me as I watch this movie, and I've seen it on a number of occasions now. And when Baldwin says that, it strikes a chord in me, and I think it will in a lot of people who identify with what James Baldwin is saying. A lot of this film is about observance, and you just saw Malcolm X with a movie camera, if you will, or I don't know what you call that, but it was a film camera that was recording James Baldwin's lecture. And Malcolm X, too, as quiet as it may be kept, was a documentarian. Liked to take pictures, took a lot of video. He was a videographer, and people don't realize that about him. When he went to Mecca, Malcolm X, he filmed at the areas. He filmed Egypt, Cairo, the pyramids. He did that. And he did the same thing with Baldwin and others. Malcolm was a keen observer. James Baldwin was too, and this segment of the movie here is called Witness. And I like the way James Baldwin characterizes the thin line between being a witness and being an actor. And part of being a journalist involves that too. And you could say that in a way, James Baldwin was a journalist. He probably would disagree with that if he was still here today. But I do think that in some ways, James Baldwin was a journalist of sorts. But he was more an advocate, obviously, than a journalist. But Baldwin was able to articulate the condition of black people, but even more than that, articulate the illness within white America and white America's inability to look itself deep in the mirror and penetrate through the fantasy that was being reflected at them, and that their media, the media was reflecting to them, that the Hollywood movies, which demeaned black people and denigrated them, had reflected to them. And Baldwin was a surgeon in doing this, and he did it not with scorn, not even really with much anger, but with passion and persuasion. And I don't know how many people who call themselves white and who call themselves white Americans understand this or grasp exactly what Baldwin meant. I suspect some do, but I'm not a white American. I'm a black man in America, and I certainly won't speak and cannot speak, obviously, for what somebody white feels about or says about or thinks about James Baldwin and what he said. I can only imagine, however, that anybody who is white who watches this film will, at least for an hour and a half, and hopefully longer and beyond the hour and a half that this movie plays, will think a lot about what James Baldwin has said, and actually gain a different perspective and then behave accordingly. And I can only hope that will happen. I can tell you one story. I once saw this film in San Francisco, a place where James Baldwin spent quite a bit of time, and also a place where James Baldwin spoke about how the racism and inequality in San Francisco and the treatment of black people in San Francisco in the 1950s and 60s was, of course, abhorrent. And he was very outspoken about this, and I'm glad he was, because it's still true. Even here in 2017, as I'm recording this at this time, it is still a racist place. And I think some of it has become a bit more blatant. Racism has never gone away in America. Racism has never gone away anywhere in the world. It's always there. And black people feel it acutely, and anyone of color, if you will, feels it acutely on the part of white people and the white power structures that exist. And so it's a question of just how loud the racism is, and But it really doesn't matter, I guess, about how loud it is. It's there, and it's not been eradicated. And James Baldwin is trying to put a program forward in this film. He's trying to get white people to really look at this, and this white people are standard by Birmingham sequence, taking this off the planet Earth and bringing it to other planets. I think it's a stroke of genius by Raoul Peck, because he's really trying to get people to see, white people in particular, specifically to see, that this is an issue that you've got to pay attention to. And we've talked about this on planet Earth. Let's take this to another planet. Maybe you'll see it better. I don't know if that's what Raoul Peck was intending, but I'm thinking that it was a very smart move to do it the way they've done it here. But my whole point about what I was saying is that when I watched this movie in the theater, one of the times I watched it in the theater, I watched it and afterwards came out of the theater, and a white woman in her late 50s, let's say she was in her early to mid 60s actually, came up to me and had a conversation, and she asked me, what do I think about I Am Not Your Negro? And I said, well, what do you think about it? I mean, I don't think there was any need for a response from me, because I found the question to be, well, I just found the question to be quote unquote interesting. I'll be polite here. But it was if she saw me as a black man and decided she wanted to hear what a black person had to say about this movie. I asked her, well, what do you think about it? And she said, well, I thought it was very good, and I loved the way that he did it, and I loved the way it was done, etc., etc. And I said, well, the challenge now is, I think, I was very clear with her, the challenge now is for, I think, white people who watch this to talk about it, and also try to activate the kinds of things that James Baldwin was advocating in it, to try to use white privilege in a positive way, and to educate white people, fellow white people in the community, about that, and about changing their attitudes towards black people and stemming the tide of racism. And she found that to be an interesting comment from me. And then later on in the conversation, which lasted maybe about 20 minutes, she started to say something about an organization that she was in, or was part of, or ran, or was a director in. And she said, yeah, this organization now, and I'm not going to say the name of the organization, but we're here in San Francisco, she said, and, we dedicate ourselves to transforming the lives of people. And by the way, let me introduce you, she said to me, let me introduce you to 3 of our people. And I'm just making up the names here: Jake, Patricia, and Robert. And they're all black. That's right. She said to me, and I'm black, as I've said, as you know. And she said to me, yeah, let me introduce you to these 3 people. They're black. And I asked her, why did you have to tell me about them being black? What's that got to do with anything? And she really didn't have an answer for that. And I said to her, I don't think that if I was a white person and we were having this very same conversation and you said exactly what you just said, that you would tell me that the people that you wanted to introduce me to were white. And she didn't have an answer for that. And she then later said, well, I didn't mean it like that. Well, I don't know. I don't know. What do you mean then? And if you didn't mean it like that, why did you say it like that? And why did you say it to begin with? And this is the kind of thing that James Baldwin's talking about. And I think that it's because I think in some instances there are a great many people who are white who are uncomfortable talking about race. And they just don't know how to have a conversation with a black person as a human being. They feel they have to have a conversation. This is my opinion. I think some white people think that they have to have a conversation with a black person as a black person. so that they have to talk to them in a quote unquote, you know, way of seeing them as a black person, instead of just talking to them just as a human being, instead of talking to them just the way they would talk to any of their friends or relatives who are white. They have to think that they've got to somehow bridge this divide and speak to black people in this different language. And, you know, black people don't have to do that. When we speak to white people, we speak to them as we speak to any fellow human being. We don't have to go through some kind of strange transformation. We just speak to them. And it's just very interesting, the reason I bring up that conversation, and this conversation that I'm bringing up with the woman who said, yeah, I'd like you to meet these three people, they're black. This happened not in 1958 or 1967. This happened in 2017. So it just goes to show you that the way I think some white people, or even a great many white people, think about race and think about conversing with black people, wow, there's just a lot of work that has to be done. And James Baldwin talks about that, you know, the idea of segregation really hurting, not just hurting black people in the obvious ways, but hurting white people, because white people just didn't have an incentive to even care about what was going on in that neighborhood, quote unquote, that neighborhood over there. And it's still very true, because if you go to Los Angeles, or in any city in America, but you go to Los Angeles, you drive by the 810, I believe, or the 660 freeway. Forgive me if I'm getting the freeways wrong, for those of you listening to this who live in Los Angeles or who know the LA freeway system. And I like to think I know it very well, as I've been there many times, but I may have got that wrong. The 710, the 8, you know, the Long Beach, the 660, whichever it is. I hope I'm getting one of those right. People drive past those freeways. Most people, most white people, most anybody drives by those freeways and doesn't drive to them unless they live there. And segregation is like that in a way. You know, you don't have to pay attention. You can just shut that off of your mind. This is a really superbly expressed sentiment by Baldwin. He is just sitting here talking to Dr. Kenneth Clark, who did those experiments back in the 1950s about white dolls and black dolls, and found that black kids preferred the white dolls in his experiments. Very powerful experiments. You should go watch those on YouTube. I think they're still there, if at all. He's just sat here and said that he is terrified by the moral apathy, the death of the heart of white Americans and of white people in America. And he describes the idea that white people have been so deluded about their own status and about the status of black people that they now believe that they are superior and that black people are not human. And Baldwin's right. He nails that, because it's very true. It's very true. And the police officers today who continue to kill unarmed black people believe the same thing. And also the system backs them up in that belief, because the system doesn't punish them. And so when they see police officers who do this, when they see a black person and they kill that black person who is unarmed, who's done nothing to them, they don't see a human being there. They see something less than human in front of them, and they kill them. And then the society and the law and the media back them up. It's true. It's very true. Just ask all the people who have been killed by police. Just ask the families of those people. Just ask Tamir Rice's family about that. 12-year-old boy. Just ask that family, Tamir Rice's family, about that situation. Police officer shot him on sight within half a second. Just ask any number of families. Just ask Eric Garner's family. Just ask Rukia Boyd's family. Just ask Sandra Bland's family. And I could go on and on and on. James Baldwin continues to celebrate his friends. And here, Lorraine Hansberry, the poet, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, if I'm not mistaken, one of the magnificent voices America ever had. And she died so young, just 34 years old. And of course, she wrote the great play, A Raisin in the Sun. Brilliant book, brilliant play. Play that's been done many times. It also was made into a film. Again, the fantasy and reality, I keep wanting to come back to this because now the fantasy here is Camelot or the Kennedys and the moral halo that's been put around the Kennedy brothers. Robert on the left there and JFK there in the center on the right-hand side of the picture. This idea that the Kennedys were quote-unquote American royalty, and we know that the Kennedys had a lot of skeletons in their closets. We also know the Kennedys did a lot of positive things in terms of humanitarian work, fighting on the behalf of the working poor and the working class. And I especially look at people like Ted Kennedy, the late senator, who of course had his demons as well, but fought passionately on the side of the working poor and the working class. JFK was not quite like that. He was a bit more conservative, and so was Robert Kennedy for a while. Although Robert Bobby Kennedy was seen as a bit less conservative. Still, he was slow to react. Even he was slow to react to the plight of black people in America during the era that Baldwin now is recounting. And this whole meeting that happened between Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, and Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time. And Lorraine Hansberry's pleading her case to him, articulating her case the way that she articulated her work. And it fell on deaf ears. And Robert Kennedy, apparently, at least from the way it was portrayed here, was quite hostile, in fact, and indifferent to what Lorraine Hansberry was saying. And the idea that we needed to have a national statement against the kind of cruelty and violence being levied by the police and the police state against black people. And Robert Kennedy was very indifferent to this and dismissive of it. And I love the way the imagery of Kennedy shows us a different angle of Kennedy that we've not really seen before. So there's an unmasking of Bobby Kennedy in a way that popular culture in America hasn't really seen. There was a movie called Bobby about 10 or so years ago that had an ensemble cast in it, and it was this laudatory, nearly 3-hour movie, which at the time I appreciated, but of course there was never any demonizing of him. It was a hagiographic, I think, look at him. And of course, movies are entitled to do that, but also movies are entitled to give us a sense of truth and reality. And as I've said, I Am Not Your Negro constantly bounces between fantasy and reality in America. What is the fantasy and what is the reality? And can you as a viewer identify which is which? Or can you identify which is fantasy to you personally and which is reality to you? And I think the answer to that depends on where you stand and who you are in the United States of America. And you've got here Bob Dylan, and this is taken from a documentary by D.A. Pennebaker called Don't Look Back from 1963. And Dylan, the great folk poet and chronicler, sings about Medgar Evers and about the work Medgar Evers did and the hero that he was, and the ambassador for justice that he was, and how his life was cruelly taken. and in front of his wife and children too, in his driveway in 1963. And I think the reason Raoul Peck uses these three figures, obviously he's using James Baldwin's text, but there's a further contextualizing, because this imagery fits in and dovetails perfectly with what Baldwin talked about, this death of the moral heart, the death of the heart of white Americans, and this idea of moral monsters, in Baldwin's words, that white Americans have become moral monsters because they have completely discounted the idea of black people being human. And the idea for those people that Baldwin was talking about, white people he was talking about, was that they're then, in that instance, if they saw black people as inhuman and less than human, or as 3/5 of a human being, as the United States Constitution once had us, then it meant that white people were absolutely free to be carefree. And we saw an image earlier of these white women who were in close-up just running, dressed all in white, running. And it was a disturbing image to me because, you know, it shows you this heedlessness, this kind of bliss, dangerous bliss. And then we see these mob figures and these violent and racist people. Look at these things. Look at what they're saying and doing. Look at the photographs. Look at the anguish, the hatred in the eyes of the white people that you see. And it's not just in the South. This is all over the country. Yeah, we see most of it in the South, but it wasn't just confined to the South. And that frenzy of violence in their faces. And then here's the devastating fantasy as well. The idea of the stereotyping and the more racist stereotyping of black people. You got these young black boys and, you know, I hate to use these words, jungle bunny, you know, that whole idea. And every time I see that image, it sickens me. It really does. And it should sicken people who have any kind of conscience. At the same time, we see how all this affects black people, and you see it here. Again, I just mentioned Tamir Rice, and there you just saw him. And here are other victims of either police murder or white people or others who have taken upon themselves to be judge, jury, and executioner against innocent black people. And you see their faces here and their names. I think James Baldwin here is absolutely correct that it's not a Negro problem. And I think he argues that it's a deflection to call it a Negro problem. He doesn't say it in this clip, but he just illustrates really what the heart of the matter is that in a country like America, specifically America, it's about looking at your life, and that white people have to look at their lives and be responsible for them directly, and stop using black people as these boogeymen. That gives you license to not look at your own life, and license to project all of your ills and evils onto innocent people. And that's really the crux of what James Baldwin is going after here, and what he's articulating in this clip that you see right now. It's a superbly crafted argument, and it's the truth, in my opinion. There is a racial problem, though. That's the only minor quibble, but I would quibble only there. But that problem of race is perpetuated as a deflection from the fact, to use Baldwin's words, that white people are not looking in the mirror at themselves and their shortcomings and their contradictions and their own hatreds and dealing with them. That is the crux of this. And he talks about, well, white women have had black men lynched knowing them to be their lovers, and white men have killed black men knowing that they're their brothers. And so Baldwin puts this in a humanist context rather than in a racial one, even though he uses the words black and white. Excuse me. He uses those words, though, as a family of mankind rather than race versus race, black versus white, white versus black. And I think it's the most effective moment that in one of those archival clips is that he nails that. This is not about race in his words. This is about responsibility. And it's funny because conservative commentators say, oh, yes, black people have to be responsible and responsible for their actions. And yet those very same people never say anything about white people having to be responsible for their actions. And that gives license once again to a very carefree white society that doesn't give a rat's about anybody else but themselves and feels that it's okay to just do whatever they want to do. I've heard this many times where I've had people I work with, some white men I've worked with, say, oh, I want to be able to say whatever I want to say. It's just, no, you have a responsibility in a group of people to be careful with what you say and think before you speak. Because if I went and said anything I wanted to say, I would be in trouble. I would lose jobs. I would lose this, that, the other. And you have to have responsibility. And the point is that white society, by and large, does not ever really, truly emphasize to white people the importance of being responsible. Yes, there are laws. Yes, there are crimes and criminal penalties for crimes committed. Yeah, but by and large, on an everyday basis, there's imagery in media. There is messages sent by the way justice is meted out to black people, and the lack of justice when it comes to black people being killed, but over sentencing when it comes to black people being criminalized. There is this message subliminally and blatantly that says that white people don't have to worry too much about responsibility, and they don't get punished sufficiently for being irresponsible. And that runs from the top, as we've seen throughout American history, whether it's government or anywhere else where white people are accused of crimes and they don't get punished sufficiently for them, or the way they should be punished. Certainly not the way that black people get punished for those very same things, or even less. I look at the affluenza kid from Texas from a few years back, and I don't remember exactly when, in the 2010s. 16-year-old white kid, white male, ran over 4 or 5 people, killing them. And he apparently was drunk, and the defense from his lawyer was, well, he didn't know the difference when he was behind the wheel because he suffered from affluenza. This is a completely made-up term. The idea that this guy was actually very rich, come from a very rich, affluent family, and so that because he was so rich, coming from such a rich family background, he was not able to discern the difference in his actions and understand what he was doing because he was so rich. And that was accepted, by the way, by the judge. And the judge, incredibly enough, sentenced him to, I guess, time served and bail, or whatever it was. He didn't spend a day in jail. I mean, it was unbelievable. So that's part of the responsibility and accountability that I am talking about and James Baldwin is talking about. A lot's happened here. And I think one of the reasons I've been talking so much is I think these images speak very clearly for themselves. And you've seen the movie before, I hope, at this point. And so you know what it is Samuel L. Jackson and James Baldwin are articulating. And The Defiant Ones is, again, a presentation of fantasy, Hollywood fantasy. And this fantasy, though, had a very clear objective, which was to make white people feel less guilty about themselves and about their actions. And while black people were hopping mad watching Sidney Poitier jump off a train, here's Godfrey Cambridge, who was in a movie called Watermelon Man, which was a film by Melvin Van Peebles that came out in the early 1970s, actually 1970, I think. And it was about a man who suddenly went from white to black. Very good movie, I recommend it. And you saw him there at Godfrey Cambridge in a Chiquita Banana commercial. And that was another problem, another big problem, and still is, this kind of desexualizing of black men. And Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, and others, these are all matinee idols, if you will. But they had a sex appeal. And it was neutralized tremendously in the 1950s and 60s. Harry Belafonte was in a film called Carmen Jones. He played a GI, if I'm not mistaken, in that movie. And Sidney Poitier in many movies in his heyday in the 1950s and 60s. It was, they oozed sex appeal. And of course, Hollywood, white Hollywood, were, I'm sure, the executives were afraid to put them in roles that may sexualize them, because perhaps they thought that not just black women, but specifically white women would find them desirable characters, desirable people sexually. And so they neutralized them in a lot of ways. And if they ever had any lovemaking scenes, the scenes were always truncated, or it seemed, or cut short, or used as quick interludes, but nothing more. So there was this desexualizing going on, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and the idea that Baldwin talks about this betrayal that happens because Sidney Poitier integrated himself, I guess, in that movie as a character into white society, to the point where he had almost been looked at as an honorary white person through that character. Not Poitier personally, but the character in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which is based in San Francisco, by the way. And this idea that he really couldn't go any further. And the movie stopped short of Poitier's character, and the character played by the white actress in the movie. I believe her first name was I forget her first name. I know Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were obviously in the movie. But I believe there was another Catherine that may have played Sidney Poitier's girlfriend / wife-to-be. And the idea that the movie really couldn't go any further than it had, except if you were going to show Sidney Poitier in bed with the woman that he was with in the movie, having sex, basically. And you saw a few moments ago that image, kind of a crude image, stereotypical, racist stereotypical image of a black man and an exaggerated features and this white woman. And, that was the whole anxiety around that movie, I think, that Baldwin was talking about. Spike Lee's Jungle Fever years later, though, put that out on the table, laid it bare, and took it to the ultimate place, which was the sex itself between the two people in that movie, Wesley Snipes and Annabella Sciorra's characters, and also the reaction to all of that as well. And that movie was released in 1991. But you saw the movie Pressure that was shown, a clip from it, and it was based on something Baldwin actually used, or I should say, Baldwin used his own personal story about how he and a white woman that he had had a relationship with had to literally in New York act as if they weren't together, and had to leave the nightclub in two separate exits, leave at two different times, and until they got home, they had to act as if they didn't know each other. And that was the existence, and still is in some instances in America, depending on where you are in the country, where you have black men and white women who behave like this, and they might be married in some instances. They don't hold hands in public, maybe. They walk one behind the other, perhaps, sometimes, in some instances. And there are some people that aren't self-conscious. They hold hands, but I've seen it happen here in California and elsewhere. And they pretend that they're not together. It's sad, but it's the truth about where we are in America with race relations and the way black people and white people look at blacks and whites who have marriages who have intimate relationships. And there's still a tension and hatred and outrage about these relationships in many quarters, both black and white. And I should say that there are some black people who don't look very favorably upon any of these types of intimate arrangements in relationships between blacks and white, no matter whom the gender and race is of the parties involved. So we go back to the Cambridge debate, and Baldwin talks about Bobby Kennedy again here, and the idea that there's a myth-making and fantasy going on, that he describes Kennedy talking about, oh yeah, there'll be a black president soon, maybe in about 40 years, and at the time, this debate in 65, I believe it was, in Cambridge University, it was just pure folly and fantasy for someone like Kennedy or anybody, white or black, to say that, oh yeah, this guy, there will be a black president someday. And especially in the 1960s to say that, because it was pure folly. However, Kennedy proved to be just about right, because literally 48 years later, 45 years later, 43 years later, President Barack Obama, black president. Yes, he was raised, and he had a white mother, and people point that out. So he's also part white as well. But for sure, Barack Obama was the first black president of the United States. And that happened in 2008. So I guess Bobby Kennedy was right after all. We're going back into the roots of the United States and how, again, black people in this country were viewed as less than, still are viewed as less than. And you see the slave auctions, the enslavement auctions, and the money that was changing hands. We were viewed as commodities and of objects, property. And the law said that too. The Constitution said that. The 3/5 clause said that. And so here we're seeing this, and we're seeing, I guess, a black man here dancing for the amusement of white people who are seated in the background and who are playing the banjo or the fiddle or whatever. We were seen as entertainers for them. And James Baldwin was saying, no, we survived in this country. We tried to stay alive. It wasn't that we were happy to be here. We were surviving. We were cultivating a language of our own as a mechanism towards surviving and thriving amidst this very hostile and violent culture and society, this hateful society that was being so violent towards us and so hateful towards us. James Baldwin argues here, again in the Cambridge debate, that the American dream goes only as far as the Negro goes. Because you can't have an American dream in America where one group of people is being treated as 3/5 of a human being and the others are treated like human beings. That is not an American dream. That's an American hypocrisy and a nightmare. It's a nightmare that Malcolm X spoke about, the American nightmare. And it's very true. We are not free until all of us are free. America is not free until everyone is free. And this movie, I Am Not Your Negro, makes that point as well. And really powerfully towards the end of the film. So I hope that you stick around and watch the entire thing and bear with me and the commentary until you get to this moment. Because it's a staggering moment. And I don't think it's been done quite this way before in a documentary feature film. Just the way it's done is very effective indeed. Those of us, or those of you, or those people in the world who say that celebrities and actors and stars should just stick to their day jobs and just act or just be celebrities, should look at this clip. You just saw Charlton Heston, Marlon Brando, Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, Joseph Mankiewicz, who was a film director, directed some Sidney Poitier movies and others. You see these people sitting here. Don't ever say that they should just stick to their day jobs. There's been a long history of activism on the part of movie stars, musicians, and all kinds of other celebrities. And it's been going on for well over 100 years in America. And I think people who say, well, they should just stick to their day jobs, I think they show a lack of insight. And I think people who say that really show not just a lack of insight, but profound ignorance. And you should really study the history of America and activism in America. They will find Joan Baez, they will find Ellen Burstyn, they will find Gloria Steinem, they will find Sammy Davis Jr., who even he got into some of it as well. They will find Frank Sinatra. They will find a whole lot of people who stood tall in these troubled times. And they will find those people today. There is a culture of apology in America. And even recently, as I record this here in 2017, and I know this will be dated, but I'm going to say it anyway. Kathy Griffin, the American comedian, apologized just recently regarding an image of Donald, whom occupies the White House at this point in time in 2017. An image that I won't go into here. It can be found online, I'm sure, if you Google it. That was violent. It was a violent image. And Kathy Griffin apologized for it. And I'm glad she did. But what I'm saying is not about Kathy Griffin, but it's about the culture of apology. And what we just saw in the movie here is a montage of politicians apologizing for things they've done. And the idea that's propounded here by Baldwin is that, America is a society that is quite simplistic, that I apologize for the wrongdoing and I'll move on now and we'll go from there. And so that is the kind of backdrop. And I think Baldwin implies that there's a naivete about this and a childishness about this that is actually not helpful. The idea that when, in particular, white people have wrongdoing, commit wrongdoing, it's pretty much an apology that suffices for most people, and that's that, and then people move on. But left unsaid there is that when black people do wrong, an apology is often not good enough. There's got to be more, and more is demanded of a black person that does something wrong in America versus when a white person does something wrong. And there are white people who literally get away with murder whether in governments or otherwise, and nothing happens to them. They're not brought to account at all. But when somebody black does something, and does something that's relatively tame in comparison, there are all these calls in white communities to, and in the media, to excoriate them beyond any apology. I'm going to use some very highly charged, for some people, examples. O.J. Simpson, who was found not guilty, and that didn't matter to most people. He ended up undoing himself anyway, and I don't approve of O.J. Simpson in terms of anything that he did regarding Nicole Brown Simpson. He was a wife beater. He was a violent man in that respect. Do I know for a fact that he murdered his wife? I don't. But I do know this. He committed sustained acts of domestic violence against her. And that I know for a fact. That happened. And I can tell you that I condemn that in every way. There seems to be just an additional pound of flesh that needs to be taken when someone black does something that's wrong. And that's the issue that I guess I'm bringing up, that Baldwin touches upon. And he touches upon it actually here with Dick Cavett. When he talks about the heroes, if we were living in a society that was fair and just, and if you were, as a white person, not so afraid of black people and didn't have to make them boogeymen, and if you were able to look into your own heart as a white person and say, and look at your life and be responsible for it instead of projecting onto someone who didn't do anything, you may then see people like Malcolm X as your hero, or Nat Turner as your hero, and not look at these people as dangerous people, because you've already put black people in this narrative that they are somehow dangerous and evil and to be feared, and they're taking over. It's a paranoia. It's a mental illness, actually, that I think resides in the hearts and minds of a lot of white people in America, still to this day. And I'm sure that some people will see that as a statement that they disagree with. But in my view, that's the truth. And that is the truth. And it accounts for why a lot of interactions between black people and white people are fraught with a lot of tension and discomfort. And it doesn't have to be that way. That's the point I think that James Baldwin's making as well. It doesn't have to be that way. Michael Vick is another example. Yeah, he did some awful things to dogs. He apologized for it. He spent time in jail for it. He spent time talking about animal cruelty, went all around the country and lectured on that, had a foundation based on preventing cruelty to animals, and set up charities to raise money to treat animals. And for some people, that wasn't good enough. I personally knew and personally had known a white person who didn't think that that was good enough, who didn't think that Michael Vick atoning for all of these things that he did, these horrible things he did with animals, was good enough. And so, like I say, there is a double standard when it comes to when black people do something wrong and when white people do something wrong, and the reaction to it. This is an important moment here about democracy and the impossibility and the fantasy of democracy. And we go back to the fantasy images again, the Gong Show, and the idea of a white picket fence, and it's something that the rest of the world has no concept of, because the rest of the world is dealing with very pressing and violent issues and things. And now we have this pure fantasy again in America. It's kind of this pure fantasy, and it's bizarre. It's a brainwashing, I'd say. The use of narcotics is this idea that, as Baldwin says, you can't distinguish this from being on psychotropic drugs. psychedelic drugs because it's just circus-like. And by the way, the Gong Show is coming back on American television. I'm not even going to plug the network, but I saw an ad for this the other day. In 2017, I'm talking, that the Gong Show is returning to TV. And we just saw clips of the Gong Show. And I remember the original Gong Show. And that clip we just saw from the Gong Show, oh my goodness. And this truth too. So tame and so ugly. Why are our lives on the American continent so tame, so ugly, and so empty, and so substanceless, so devoid of substance? And I love this moment. We refuse to see ourselves as we are, but we only see ourselves as we would like to be. And that is what American media has done, has projected this idea of us in this fantasy world while we're not really looking at ourselves and the truth of who we are. While the truth of who we are is dotted all around us in these very violent episodes, in police brutality, in mob mentality violence, in all these things that happen to women in the world and in America, and what happens to black people in the world in America. And we're not looking at it. We're occupying ourselves with the Gong Show, or with, all these other outrageous reality TV things. And that's what's happened now. We're now in the reality TV culture, and what clips you've seen are predating reality TV. Now, most of television is about reality TV, and that stuff is now produced on the cheap, and then makes money for ratings, and it's a windfall. But reality TV is very cheaply produced, and it's very scripted. And 85% of what's on television today, if not more, is pure reality television. And so this is now an even bigger proliferation of what James Baldwin was speaking about in the late 1970s in his manuscript. And here now, in this day and age, in 2017 and beyond, you've got reality TV, which becomes, as I said, about 90% of everything on television. And it's not an exaggeration. This fantasy has completely swamped America and consumed it for decades. And now it has culminated in reality TV. And now people talk about things like fake news. And in one sense, the news isn't real anymore, because the news has become a profiteering mechanism. So that's the factor. News isn't real. If you look at news today in America, there's very little substance. You have to go to independent channels like Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! And other places to get real news, or go to websites outside of the US to get real news, because the corporate networks in America are all profit-based, and the news networks in America on those corporate channels do not tell you what's really going on in the country. So when you combine that with reality TV, you find an American populace that is not well educated at all and is very dumbed down. And this is the thing that James Baldwin was talking about. We are seeing ourselves as we would like to be, not as we actually are. And that is a very dangerous thing. Very dangerous indeed. James Baldwin here on the Dick Cavett Show lays out another excellent analysis about it doesn't matter whether white people don't like us or not. What I know is the practice and the actual actions show very much where we stand with white people and with the white power structure. Our schools, the housing, everything is not of a standard that is habitable or is respectable. And we are being treated as second-class citizens is essentially what Baldwin is saying. And that is exactly what white people are doing to us in the power structure. And so that is the issue here. Not about what a white person says or whether they like us or not. And that's why I've always argued personally that it doesn't matter whether someone likes me or not. It's about whether they respect me or not. And respect, certainly to me, would be, okay, you have schools that are respectable. You have schools where children can learn, where black children can be educated, housing where black people can live, that is in the neighborhoods that white neighborhoods housing is, or in the neighborhoods or in any area that is a house that is in a community that is safe and clean. And, that's what respect is. People are respected. And the housing and everything else would show that, not this substandard housing in neighborhoods that are not redeveloped or done in a way that white neighborhoods are. More fantasy here. The Pajama Game. This musical, and by the way, films like La La Land that come much, much later, some 50 or 60 years later after the Pajama Game. I think the Pajama Game is 1957. So about 60 years later, La La Land, which borrowed from this movie, as you can see if you've watched La La Land, this whole fantasy. And here again is the reality. There's Eric Garner. There's the New Orleans police. There is what happened to Oscar Grant. And then we have the NAACP back in the 60s. So all these events, and Dr. King, all these events come around, and Malcolm X, again, you see the three figures, Medgar, Malcolm, Medgar, Martin, and Malcolm. And then the fantasy of the reality, because this was the truth, by the way, here. This was the truth. What you see there in that movie, Soldier Blue, which was given so much heat when it came out in 1970 because it showed you beheadings. It showed you what the white soldiers did to Native Americans. It showed you the truth, and that was too much for people to handle. That's the issue. And when we're shielded from the truth, and we're sanitized, and we are given these images that aren't violent, and we are given these tidy, smiley faces, and people happy with their oppression, as they were in Gone with the Wind, and these very happy-go-lucky black people, when in fact they were being murdered and slaughtered and raped. You don't do yourself you do yourself a disservice, is what I'm saying. And you really do yourself, and the country does itself a disservice. White America does itself a huge disservice. And that is the kind of invention that has perpetuated this fantasy, and is dangerous. And James Baldwin has echoed that throughout his work and throughout this film. I want to go back to the reality and the fantasy, and the idea that you have people who say, well, celebrities should stick to what they do and don't be activists, and stay on their day job, don't quit the day job. Well, again, it's the idea of fantasy and reality colliding in this instance, because Marlon Brando and all these others, Sidney Poitier, all these folks who did this for a living on the big screen, who do this for a living on the big screen, created a fantasy on the big screen in films like Gone with the Wind, with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in Sidney Poitier's case, but yet off screen he balanced that with very real activism that dealt with the times. So there's that fantasy and reality blurring, or separating, because there was a demarcation, if you will, between what Sidney Poitier may have done in films like Lilies of the Field, which he won an Oscar for, or films like In the Heat of the Night, which I think was a great portrayal, a great film in that respect, in terms of what it was saying, on films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and then off screen his activism, or Harry Belafonte's activism, which still continues here in 2017 as I record this. It's something that this idea of keeping your day job, is as if celebrities are assigned a role and they've got to stay within that box. And I don't like the term "stay in your lane," because I think that term, while I understand the meaning of that term, I don't think it's always used in a way that really makes a lot of sense, because Should Sidney Poitier have stayed in his lane? Should, should Harry Belafonte have done that? Should any of these celebrities who are activists have done that? Should they not have fought for justice and human rights and civil rights and for women's issues? Should they have just stayed in their Hollywood bubble and cocoon and done nothing? I mean, should Ariana Grande just stay in her lane and not speak out and comfort people who had been affected by what happened in Manchester in 2017, the bombing after the end of one of her concerts? I mean, I think the idea of celebrities and activists, celebrities and actors not doing anything about the world around them, I think is foolish. In fact, the function of an artist is to affect the world and raise questions about the world around them. That's the quintessence of what an artist does, what a celebrity, or I should say what an actor does. In fact, a celebrity or an actor or any kind of artist at all, a musician, has the responsibility to do that because they're in a unique position to do that, particularly actors. And Viola Davis spoke about this in 2017 when she won the Oscar for her performance in Fences, that, we are the only profession that really gets to have this great responsibility to portray the reality of everyday people. And that is something that is so undeniably true. And this idea that, celebrities and that actors have to stay in their lane and just act and don't do anything and it's just pathetic, because their day job actually is to show a reality about the condition of human beings, the human condition. Even in films that aren't honest, there's a portrayal of the human condition somewhere or other in those movies. And so it's just fool's gold. And I think people who say that actors should just stick to their day jobs are the kinds of people who want to live in a fantasy world where they don't want to be told the truth. They don't want to know about what's really going on around them. They want to be anesthetized and put in these fairy tale dream world like camps, these dream world states of being. And it's something that does immense damage to the American psyche and to the white psyche, to pretend that all is nice and easy, and while life is tough, just pretend that the world around you is just a complete fantasy world. I think that when you have a world like this one, you have a responsibility to try and change it in your own small way. And I think that's what Baldwin's talking about. And he's saying that to white Americans as the group who are in the majority in America, and the group who have the power in America, in the power structures, who have white privilege, have that responsibility. And I think the truth and the fantasy are exposed here in these clips when you see movies like Elephant by Gus Van Sant, and how yet with all this seemingly ascendancy from white America, there's still all these contradictions in white America. White men, white boys, young boys committing mass murders, to this very day, shooting up shopping malls, killing people in universities and colleges, in movie theaters. We've seen this over and over and over again. And those incidents are presented as if those are things in isolation, even though the most dangerous group of people in America, based on studies and surveys and everything else, happen to be white men. The kind of terror that people should be most concerned about is from white boys and white men, more so than any other group. And yet you have someone in the White House in 2017 saying, well, the problem is, this group of people from this part of the world. And it's just ridiculous, while completely ignoring the acts that happened in Portland in 2017, with a white man stabbing to death two white men who had tried to intervene from that particular man attacking two black women, two black girls, young girls, or whether it was the shooting in Kansas, the shooting death of an Indian American man in Kansas by a white man, and the guy in the White House said nothing about those things, or said very little about them, or sends a tweet out from his official account, not from his personal one, condemning the actions. And that's the kind of fantasy that we're living in, and that they are living in, and that people who are in the White House are living in. And here we have another great juxtaposition of fantasy and reality. Here's the fantasy part. You know, Doris Day and Lover Come Back. And, someone who's bejeweled and dressed, it looks like $1 billion, wearing all this jewelry and all this kind of stuff, this rich upper cruster, and singing about can a man come to me and enrich my life, and does he love me, and will it happen, and all this kind of fantasy stuff with these jewels that cost $1 billion. And there you see, boom, the juxtaposition of what's really going on in this country. Around the same time, black men and women lynched from the highest trees. And this is the truth. It's an ugly truth, but it's the truth. You never had to look at me. I had to look at you. I know more about you than you know about me. And that is the ultimate truth in America. And these words, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that is so true. Baldwin said it best. We will never be able to move forward in a society until we first look and deal with what the history of the society and the country is and has been. And that history continues. It's present. William Faulkner talked about that too. It's not even past. I'm just paraphrasing part of what he said. Faulkner was correct too. And this is the great crescendo of the film. The world is not white. It never was white. It cannot be white. And white is an artificial construct, Baldwin is saying, a metaphor for power. And you know what? For the first time in my own life, I agree with that sentiment. And I never heard it ever articulated like this before. And I do agree with Baldwin, that white is a metaphor for power. And so when you saw those signs earlier in the movie about white power, yeah, it's kind of redundant, because white is a metaphor for power. And I agree, the world is not white. It's really not. And I hope people give what I've just said and what Baldwin has said some thought before jumping to react to it. I think these shots here are very powerful that you've just seen. This final clip, is another crux. James Baldwin said this over 50 years ago. And this is his challenge to white America right now. This is not about politicians here. This is about everyday white Americans. Are white Americans going to embrace the black person they've demonized? Are they going to change their attitude towards that person? Are they going to? Or are they going to continue to perpetuate this insane boogeyman in their own minds? And law has been built around a figment of their imaginations. It's such a dangerous and disturbing thing, but that's the truth. And will white people at large do this? And do they have it in them to do it? And James Baldwin is talking about that. You've got to find out why you invented this black boogeyman, and he uses the N-word. And the future of America depends on that. The future of the United States of America depends on whether or not white people will continue to perpetuate this, whether it's on a personal level or through media or whatever. And once that question gets answered, and answered in a very definitive way, only then will we really find out what the future of America is going to look like. And right now, that question is still very much open to interpretation, but not really to interpretation. The answer is still very much hanging in the air. I want to, at this point, thank everybody. Thank you and anybody else. I want to thank you specifically for listening to me for the last hour and a half give my thoughts about this great documentary, about my thoughts about James Baldwin, my thoughts about race, my thoughts about black people and white people in America, in the United States, and about the history. Because this is really an issue, this is a huge problem. And it's not a Negro problem, it's, if anything, it's a white problem. And you see all of these credits here, all these archives. I would urge you to go look at all of these archives, as many of them as you can find. Look at them look them up online, if you can, find them and look at them, because this is an amazing archival research. I would urge you to do it. I really would. I would urge you to watch this film again. I would urge you to share this film with people you know. I would urge you to, if you are a teacher, hold this movie for a screening in your class. Make it required for your class. It should be required for every classroom in America from age 10 upwards. I urge anybody who has a copy of this film to invite people over, friends, family members, and have them watch and have discussions about it. And more than that, form groups and organizations to combat racism, to end racism, to unlearn racism in white communities. I urge white people to do that. There are some who are doing it now, unlearning racism, anti-racism people, and I know of them. I urge people to really get on board with them. There's people like Tim Wise, there's people up in Seattle who are doing this, and other parts of America. Please get on board with that. Join movements. Don't just join the movements that black people are in, but join movements, create movements in white communities, and educate people in white communities, and dedicate that as a mission for yourself and for the future generation, the millennials and everybody else. Go into white communities and teach your fellow white brethren, and educate them and encourage them and persuade them, and have their ear, and stress the importance and the need to end racism in the small ways that you can do that on a personal basis, and hopefully after that on an institutionalized basis. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Omar Moore.